probably actually stressed out of mine. Yeah. The other ones is just sports. Yeah. It has to do with your steering. That's how it feels now. Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what I'm not. I just leave it up to them. Good morning, Ms. Ma'am. One thing going around.
I have one person on my side. I read a lot of books. That's all I do. I read a lot of books. Okay, good evening.
Good evening.
It is vacant in this hall tonight. Ooh, man. Don't know if people are running late or just not feeling good, but those who are here, we thank you for being here. We do need to be mindful in light of just the changing temperature and daylight getting a little bit less and less each day. It's going to be a little trying here in a few months, especially after daylight savings time. We'll go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. We're going to pick up where we left off last week on our last slide on the first lesson, and then we're going to go into the new lesson that is for tonight. We'll ask Brother Jim if he can lead us in our opening prayer.
Keep them safe while they're going on their end and safe trip back home. So thank you, dear Heavenly Father, for each and every one of the brothers and sisters right here in this congregation. Pray that each and every one will strive to do better and learn more about your word until that we can follow after you. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your Son Jesus who came, suffered, died, and killed death on the cross that we might have forgiven our sins. We pray, Father, we look back to the cross each and every day, realizing the sacrifice was made for us. Heavenly Father, we're also thankful for our physical blessings and things that we have to use. It makes it easier for us. And we pray for the ones less fortunate than us, the ones that are struggling in life, struggles and trials. We pray that they'll reach out to you for guidance. Be with the ones that haven't accepted Christ as their Savior yet, and pray that they will. Too late for them to do so. Your Heavenly Father, be with each and every one of those this evening. Let us learn to love one another more and to look out for each other. Your Heavenly Father, we pray that we will conduct our lives in a way out in the community that people will know that we are Christians and we can try to bring others to the Jesus Christ.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, where we left off, we were looking at, as we look across the book of Genesis, there are 5 different things that we find that the book emphasizes and teaches us about life, how we can better live through the book of Genesis. First of which, I find the theme of creation. We're going to talk about tonight one of the major things we find in the garden scene, especially just in chapter 1, is that the word good is going to be used over and over and over again. And when I look in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, it shows me what a good created thing or a good creation will do toward a good creator. We look at the end of chapter 1, verse 31. God would see all that he made, and he would say, it's very good. In chapter 15, verse 6, in light of goodness, Abraham would actually make reference to God in using that same term about his character. In fact, it would say that Abraham believed in the Lord and he accounted it to him for righteousness. One who is good before God, the way the New Testament describes it, is one who is righteous before God. But if we look at the true definition of righteousness, it is defined by God. So what we find Abraham doing, even through the rest of the book in chapter 28 with Jacob and Esau, and also chapter 50, when we look at the life of Joseph, you know, what you meant for me, or what you meant for my life was evil, but God meant it for good. And when we look at how creation is supposed to function in all these different aspects, chapter 1, creation, chapter 15, promise of descendants, it's counted to Abraham for righteousness. Chapter 28, we look at Jacob and Esau in light of Jacob being good. And then we look at chapter 50 and we look at Joseph of under trials. How can creation still be good? Well, the idea is if we're living how God wants us to live, then whether we're under persecution or we're brand new in life or we're in the middle of our life, we can always be good before God. So when I look at the idea of creation, that's going to be an idea of how we can be good. Number 2, sin. The word I want to use for sin, Genesis teaches me different ways to guard against sin. You know, we normally talk about chapter 4 when we talk about Cain and Abel. And God would tell Cain, you know, sin lies at the door. Its desire is for you, but you should have control over it. And before that, really, Cain would say whenever God asked the question afterwards, where's your brother Abel? Well, am I my brother's keeper? And then you go over to chapter 9 and you find that weird story about Ham and Noah. But the idea in light of Ham and Noah, Ham being the son of Noah, is that he didn't have human decency to care for his father. So in chapter 4, am I my brother's keeper? Yes. Chapter 9, am I my father's keeper? Yes. Who did Jesus say we're to be a neighbor for, or a good neighbor for? Anyone in need. So when I look at what sin can do in my life, it can ruin my respect for others in this life, but also I look in chapter 19 and I look at Sodom and Gomorrah and I find that there were individuals who failed to guard themselves against sin and brought on the judgment of God. So, how can I live good in this present world? How can I guard myself against sin, both in my life and sin that might be around me? But also, number 3, God's promises. I look at the different promises. Chapter 9, the rainbow promise. Chapter 14. Now, this promise is interesting because it's a promise that's made to Lot. It's not a promise made to Abraham. It's a promise made to Lot, which I find intriguing. And then I look in chapter 21 and I see another promise, at least the son promise, coming to fruition where Isaac is born. In chapter 24, I find a promise between Abraham and his servant. In chapter 50, I see a promise between Joseph and his children saying, hey, take my bones out of this place when you leave this nation, because God has promised there's going to be a time after you're oppressed for about 400-ish years that God's going to deliver you and bring you out of this country. And God kept every single one of those promises. When I look at promises, God is more than happy to give. But what do we give in return in light of His promises for us? So how can I live good? How can I guard against sin? How can I receive the blessings that God desires to give me through His promises? Number 4, the word faith. How can I look with confidence in all that God reveals? Chapter 2, verse 15 through 17, where it talks about the tree of knowledge and good and evil. Well, God instructed Adam and Eve, do not eat of this tree. Now, if God didn't care, then here's what would have happened. Okay, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. I want you to love your wife. Wife, I want you to love your husband. I want you to tend to this garden and then go out. Could you imagine the surprise on Adam and Eve's face when they would have ate of the tree? They were never commanded not to eat of the tree. And then out of the blue, God says, why'd you eat that tree? Didn't you know you're not supposed to? God informed them. Faith informs, faith instructs, and faith also protects. So when I look at faith across the book of Genesis, I'm looking at a guide, whether it's Adam and Eve, or it's Noah and his family, or I'm looking at Joseph in his life. The 5th one, endurance. When I look at the ultimate aim for this book, it's a book of beginnings in light of creation, sin, promises, faith, but also how to endure through different circumstances. We look at the life of Abraham in chapter 12 to 25. Think about, he started at 75. Maybe the last major story we have of him is when him and Isaac go up on the mountain. So he's well into his hundreds by that point, maybe about 115, 125, somewhere in there. But his endurance, living faithfully, even Noah living in a wicked generation, even Lot being enduring, as Peter would say, that his soul was vexed daily. And even Joseph, in light of his life, if you look at the text, when he's sold into slavery, and then even before he becomes second in command, there's a phrase that's emphasized multiple times, and the Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord was with Joseph. In prison, the Lord was with Joseph. Accused by Potiphar's wife, thrown back in this place, the Lord was with him. So when I look at blessings in light of maybe not ideal circumstances, trials in life, well, God desires for us to endure. Now, I want you to look at all those color words: good, guard, giver, guide, goal. That is, if I want to live the lessons that I learned through Genesis, that should be our aim in everything that we do. So what we're going to do now, we're going to move from our general overview of the book, and we're going to look at Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 7. When I look at the beginning, this is probably one of the greatest known or the best known aspects of the Bible because it's in the beginning. How many people have ever said, I'm going to read through the Bible, and then you start in Genesis 1:1, you're like, man, yeah, that's so cool. And then you get to chapter 2, it's like, why is it giving me all this information? Chapter 3, ooh, I've heard this story when growing up. Chapter 4, ooh, Cain's bad. He's bad. Ooh, I wouldn't want to be in his shoes. Chapter 5, I can't pronounce half these names. And you don't even make it through chapter 5. You just stop because it's like, I can't pronounce this. I don't even know why it's saying all this. Well, you're in good hands. A lot of people do that. When I look at the beginning of Genesis, it is important on many different reasons. If you'll look at the man in the background, the idea of what God desires us to do in our lives is to have His Word in our heart. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 3, it tells me by faith, God spoke, or we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of the things which are visible. So it only makes sense, as the Hebrew writer would say, when you go back to Genesis 1, this is the beginning of all faith, the beginning of all instruction, and the beginning of all causing to understand. Now, what's interesting, that word, we're going to use that word for our 4 points of what we can learn as we look across Genesis 1 to chapter 2, verse 7. Now, the reason I have chapter 2, verse 7, if you look in chapter 2, verse number 4, it would say something to the extent, now this is the history or the genealogy of the creation of the heavens and the earth. So when I get to verse number 7, and it talks about that God breathed into man, and man became a living being, that is the end of the history of creation. So when I get to chapter 2, verse 8, that begins the prelude to the Edenic scene, which we'll talk about in our next lesson. So we could go through this in a couple different ways. We could either focus on every single day of creation, which I have found a piece of artwork that is just incredible, and it helps us work through all 6 of our days, and we're even going to sing the song tonight, so I hope you got your singing voices ready. I'm kidding. But when I look through the days of creation, I mean, we could talk about the different things that took place on day 1, day 2, day 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that's good. We should probably know those things. There's bigger implications from the order of how things are made. But there's a little bit more that we need to get from this text. So I'm not just going to focus on God made this on day 1, God made this on day 2. But on your paper, it would say this is a textual evaluation and an apologetical analysis of the text. There are a lot of different things that people will argue just from Genesis chapter 1. And if we're not careful, we might actually advocate some things from Genesis that really the creation story does not attest to. We're not really going to talk about evolution. I feel like that would be a whole series by itself. But we are going to look at these are things that are necessary, not just for us to know, but even our children need to know these things before they go to college. Because if they start hearing words they've never heard before, and they start going in their biology classes or their physics classes, and they're hearing all about the origin of the world, and they're hearing all these 10-cent words or $1 words, and you're like, what in the world? But this guy's got a PhD, so really he's got to know what he's talking about. It sounds complex. It's not as complex as we make it out to be. So, textual, apologetical. We're going to look at how we can defend creation just by using the word, and the Word of God. I want us to begin by looking at creation through wisdom in creation. We're actually going to begin in the book of Proverbs. If you want to look over in Proverbs 8, verse 21 through 31, I know it's going to be somewhat small on the screen, but I want to begin here because what the proverb writer tells me is that from the very beginning, God used wisdom before He ever framed the worlds. Now, I was reading someone else's lesson where it was basically trying to distinguish, is there a difference between calling God the maker of the world, God the creator of the world, and God the designer of the world? And it went through it honestly was boring in the beginning part, but it did make a good point. Sometimes we use certain words and there's some implications behind it. If I say that I'm going to make a cake, how long does that normally take? I know it depends on the cake, but how long does it normally take? We'll say max, a normal cake, a normal birthday cake. You're making it at home, not box. If it's box, it's already made. Making the whole cake. So starting from you got your ingredients, how long does it take from that point, putting your ingredients together, mixing everything, baking it, and you're done? Well, you got to decorate it. Okay, so it's going to be a few hours. Now, what if I said you were going to design a cake? We're not talking about weddings. If you're designing a cake, that's a little bit different. If someone builds a house versus designs a house, those are two very different things. Building, there is already a plan in place, or there should be a plan in place, otherwise you'll be able to tell if they just baked a house, so to speak, or actually built a house, which takes a little bit of time. But designing a house, you got to think about how many rooms. What is it going to be? 1 story, 2 story? Is there going to be a basement? What's the foundation like just on the property? Is there already plumbing lines already there? Is there electricity running over there? If there's not, what kind of permits do I need to get? And there's so much more planning involved behind the idea of designer. Now, builder requires as much skill, but in different areas. It has to be able to read the blueprints of the designer, but also it has to make it to whatever the designs say. What I find in Proverbs 8 is that in the designing process, God used wisdom. In Proverbs 8, 21 through 31, give me that idea. Notice it would say, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of His way, before His works of old. I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. So we're in the designing phase. When there was no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no foundations abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills I was brought forth. While as yet He had not made the earth or the fields or the primal dust of the world. When He prepared the heavens, I was there. When He drew a circle on the face of the deep, when He assigned to the sea its limits so that the waters would not transgress His command, when He marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside Him as a master craftsman. And I was daily His delight, rejoicing always before Him, rejoicing in His inhabited world, and my delight was with the sons of men. Wisdom is personifying herself in this text by saying, when you look around you, it is undeniable there was wisdom involved with all of creation. I can look at Psalm 104, verse 24, and it tells me that same idea that God had built the world using wisdom. So if I think of how successful I am at making a cake, so that ability is going to vary in this room from I can't to I'm pretty good at it. I want you to imagine going from cake designing / baking to I want you to make a whole new universe, a life that can sustain itself. I mean, it's going to run down. We'll talk about that here in a second. But I want you to be able to make beings that are made just in your image. And it's just you can create all these things. I want you to create a reality where you just say something and it is. Now, how powerful of a being is required for I speak and it happens? That's a lot of power. But this is not the power aspect. This is about the design. Wisdom in creation is evident before all. Now, in light of the wisdom looking at design, there are 4 different arguments when we are looking at design. These are some of those college terms that our young ones do need to know at some point before they leave to go to college. There are 4 different types of arguments when we're arguing from design. There is another argument, but that's an argument for a designer. We'll talk about that here in a second. The first one's called the cosmological argument. In other words, there must be a first cause for all of this. All of these arguments are, I'm looking at the world around me and I'm deducing from what I'm seeing, okay, there must be something else. Cosmological does this, as Hebrews 3 verse 4 would say, every house must have a what? There must be a builder. There must be a builder. And if there is a builder of the house, then he must have used some kind of order or design. Cosmological argument says, as I look around, I can't really explain the complexities of why the water currents do what they do under the ocean, but they don't work the same way when they're at the top of the ocean. I have to look at that complexity with looking at space and looking at the stars and the planets, and I'm looking at different kind of geological or geographical type features, and I'm looking at rocks, and I'm looking at what constitutes the physics of a gas versus a poisonous gas, what makes life possible on a planet versus not possible. So I got to know some chemistry, some biology with that. Oh, and along with space and the waters, the human body, just the human body. There are still a lot of things about the human body, even most doctors and surgeons would say, we just don't know. There's just not that much information. Cosmological looks at the complexity of design and says, well, if that's here, they ask the question children do, where did that come from? Where did that come from? So if children are even asking what is considered the first design argument, that's something we need to be mindful of too when we're talking to others. The second one's called the teleological argument. Teleological argument basically looks at the complexity of life, the order of life, and even purpose that gives evidence of an intelligent designer. When I look at me, sometimes I think I did not have an intelligent design, but God gave me something, so I'm trying to work with that. But if you look at a watch or you look at your iPhone, normally they use a watch illustration for this. Inside a watch, you will find that, first you got to figure out a way to get the glass off, not with a hammer, but you get the glass cover to come off, and then there's some little screws on the back on some of them. Some of them on the older watches, they just kind of have like a pop mechanism where if you can get that mechanism, it will allow that cover to come off. And as you look at those designs, there are cogs that are put into specific places and they have a specific function. And some of those cogs will move a little faster than others. And you look at just how everything is made. You can tell just by looking at a watch, there is a watchmaker. If you look at creation, and you really think about every aspect of reality, there is no other plausible answer than there must be some kind of intelligent designer somewhere out there. Now, a good verse to use with this is Romans 1, verse 20. The invisible attributes of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made. That is an argument from design. I'm looking at the visible, and the visible is giving me evidence in some way about the invisible one. But more than just about the invisible one, it just tells me there is something greater. Now, to go along with teleological, this is not one of your 4 arguments, but it's also important to know the argument that's called ontological. Ontological is argument of a designer. When I look at the complexities of life and I realize there must be an intelligent designer, the ontological argument does this. Is God capable? Does He have the power, ability, and just everything involved with what would be required to make the universe that we have? Does He have all that? Does He have more than that? Because if He does, ontological argument would say, then God can fit the right mold for the right kind of designer necessary for what I'm deducing from there must be an intelligent designer. So teleological, there must be a greater designer. Ontological, does the person I say who made these things have all the abilities and powers to make that happen? So argument from design, argument for designer. Argument number 3, this one's anthropological, basically looking at human beings. When I look at humans, I have a lot of different responses. But when I look at the complexities of things within human beings that doctors, psychiatrists, scholars cannot explain, what's the conscience? I mean, I know they've stuck diodes on a brain before, and people would think things, and they can chart out the brain waves and stuff. But the anthropological argument is this: there are some things we cannot explain about the human body and the way that the human mind works, and abstract things like emotion. We can't explain how all those things are possible unless if there is something greater than a human being who can give them all those things. Did you know when I read through Ecclesiastes chapter 3? Oh wait, I've got chapter 2 in here. Sorry, 3 is the next one. Chapter 2, Romans 2, 14 and 15 would tell me that the Gentiles who never were given the law of Moses had this thing called a conscience that was written on their heart. Do you know who it attributes to putting that conscience in the Gentiles? God. That's the anthropological argument. How can people have things that no other creature in creation has? And I keep going back through human history. There's no one powerful enough to be able to put that into the human mind unless there is a higher being. 4th argument. From a spiritual or religious aspect, every single person to ever live has had a desire to want to worship or praise something. In fact, oftentimes they will think about this concept of immortality. Really, the Bible portrays it as eternity. Now, this is Ecclesiastes 3, verse number 11, where it would say that God has placed eternity in the hearts of men. God has caused us to think about this idea of what's going to happen beyond me. I know I'm not going to live forever, but what if I could? Or what if I do live forever? And if I don't have the Bible, I don't really have the answer for that. I could kind of fantasize what that might be. Just look at pagan mythology. All that is people trying to think in a very imaginative way, Romans chapter 1, what's going to happen to us after this life. They even try to explain how we get all the blessings that we have. So it can't just be one God. That's just not possible. So we come up with all these different gods, and we say this God's in control of this area of life, and this God's in control of all this. And sometimes they get in fights because human beings get in fights. So if we're made in the image of the gods, then the gods must get in fights too. And they try to use a very humanistic way of describing why things are what they are. But even if you look at the nature of people from the beginning, every single culture has sought to worship something. And did you know that the number one problem throughout the Bible is people not worshiping the right thing? That's called sin. So when I look at those four arguments for design, cosmological, I can look around me and ask the question, okay, where did that come from? Where did that come from? Ultimately, it will lead me to, there has to be something greater. Teleological, I look at the complexities of all this. I look at all the intricate designs and say, there must be an intelligent designer behind all this. Anthropological, I'm looking at human beings, and I'm looking at things that science cannot explain because science didn't make that. The God of science did. God did. And then I look at the religious aspect. People are seeking to worship something, and they're thinking about an eternity, just like they were made in the image of God to do such. Yes? Okay. No, not really. These actually go hand in hand with science. So if we're trying to look at, think of the scientific method, you have a hypothesis, and then they have a system. And you got to go through that system asking questions to see if they're going to be yes or no. If it's a yes, then that must mean this. If it's a no, then it must mean this. Cosmological is the same thing. I'm looking at something, and I'm asking questions. Okay, this apple, who made this apple? Well, I could have a couple different answers for that. Either I believe the apple tree where I picked this apple from, it made the apple. I believe my local Walmart, fresh produce, made the apple because that's where I bought it. So maybe Walmart is the designer. But it's asking questions. There's nothing that goes against science in asking questions. What is not true science is when they begin to push a theory and say, well, that theory's true. All of these are just different ways to test whether or not something does exist or not. It's not against science, it actually works with science. So if someone is saying that it doesn't work with science, hold on, are we not asking questions in all four of these? How is that not a scientific deductive method? It is. So it's not against, it works with. So, is that? Okay, it's good. Good question. So those arguments, keep those in mind. Yes? Ecclesiastes? Okay. Oh, you're reading the last half. Okay. Correct. So that's like, so when you read that weird prelude in chapter 1, I think it's like verse 4 to the middle, and it talks about this is the whole cycle of creation. The sun rises, it goes back down, the sea, it goes down in the rain, and then it moves in the river, and then it comes back up. It just goes through the circle of life. If someone were to try to exhaust to figure out how God did absolutely everything, you can't. You can't. Even if I try to look through human history and accomplishments, I'll still come to the same problem. I can't do that either. And that's why throughout, at least in this beginning conclusion that he makes here in chapter 3, the first of 4, he begins to say, you know, I did things that there is a definite end for these building houses, hiring servants, had a lot of money. There's a definite end to those things. But then there's still a thought in my mind where I'm still running the test on, well, I'm still trying to figure out things about God. And so far, my ending conclusion is you can't find out when he started all that, and you can't find out when he ends all this. So there are some things that are frugal efforts, And that is something else to consider as well. You know, we talk sometimes about when's the best time to obey God. Like, do you ever feel like you're fully ready to actually, okay, I've changed everything I need to in my life. I'm ready to give my life over to God. Or you still have some insecurities within and you say, no, I need to do this because if I don't do it now, I never will. If you wait till you try to figure out everything about God before you follow Him, you won't. But when I look through the New Testament and I see what caused people to believe, they didn't understand all the secrets and mysteries about space and life and all of the universe. They understood simple concepts like, you have a soul, you've sinned, that sin caused God to send His Son and die for you, and you have the availability to be forgiven of those sins. Otherwise, for all eternity, you're going to be separated from God in eternal judgment and condemnation. So you have a choice. During your time of learning, do you choose to follow Him and obey Him so that He'll reward you with everlasting life? Or do you choose to reject Him and He'll reject you in the last day? Just that concept alone, I can understand that. And that's all God wants us to do. So if we try to drive ourselves crazy, yeah, I think that's what the second half of verse 11 is emphasizing. It's not that we're trying to figure out everything about God, but if we ask the right questions, God will point us where we need to go. And that's the point. Argument for design also helps us to see the different things that God has put in place. I don't have this verse on the screen. Nope, no, I don't. When you look in chapter 12, and it talks about verse 9 to 12, and it talks about that a skilled craftsman or a master of assemblies, they all are like the words of a goad. A well-fastened nail is like a master of assemblies. The idea of how he speaks, he goes point 1, point 2, point 3, conclusion. And then he goes to words of truth are like, I'm messing it up. There's well-fastened goad, master of assemblies, but all of those things are given by one shepherd. When you look at Solomon's conclusion in that text, he says, if you are trying to find absolute truth, the evidence, the facts, what will lead you to the knowledge of the truth, God has set that in place and you cannot move it. But also consider this as well, because truth cannot be moved, you can't deny it once you find it. And if you do, you're only lying against the facts. So when I look at Ecclesiastes, not only does he argue about what is our purpose in life, but also he would say if you're really looking for the words of truth, you can find it if you are honest with the evidence, and it will ultimately lead you to, it would say in that text, as it is given by one shepherd. God knew what He was doing when He designed the world. God also knew what He was doing when He designed His Word, both of which can lead you to the conclusion there is a God. Good questions, good questions.
No text to go by. Yet even like the Zulus and some of those tribes, Africa, they may be taught now, they even believed in a supreme creator, even though they had nothing to go by, other than it was in their faith system. It's kind of in their spiritual. Number 4, they had a desire to worship a God. They didn't know, hopefully they found out in modern day years, there were people that worshiped some kind of God that had nothing to go by, no word God to go by.
You know how it mentions the Ethiopian eunuch? So Ethiopia, that's in Africa. It's got Simon of Cyrene. We just talked about him recently. Cyrene is on the northern tip of Africa going towards the west. And then you have the queen of the south, a queen of Egypt. That's in Africa as well. Who in the world told them about the God of the Jews? Why in the world was Simon or even the Ethiopian eunuch in Jerusalem? For whatever reason. Well, there was a desire somewhere, but there was information as well. You know, a lot of people tend to talk about like the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Indians, how they have these crazy type of ideas of religion. Well, they too, just like the Africans in times past, sought after a divine being to worship. But because they didn't have special inspiration, you've got general inspiration, which is design. Special inspiration gives me information about the things that I have questions about. So somewhere along the way, not only do we see evidence for number 4, but also we see from the Word it connects that idea from here's what you've been lacking that creation will not give you the answers for. So that's really good, really good. Yes? That is the Romans 2:14, 15. Sorry, I didn't mean, was that the end of your statement? Yeah, it falls into that. That's the human evidence, just the complexity of design beyond just how it's built. There's still things we can't explain. Well, it's because God made it, and He doesn't necessarily explain it that much. However, I do believe if you do a study on the heart, the mind, or if you're using KJV, the bowels of a man, all of those constitute what God would call the conscience in the New Testament. If I look at the Bible as to what it says about that, I'll actually learn more about the conscience than what science will tell me about the conscience, because the conscience wasn't made by science, it was made by the God of science, the God of all creation. So yeah, really good point. Okay, order. Okay, second point as we go through the word. We're not getting through this lesson tonight. It's okay. When I look at order, I can look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and I will find that life requires 4 things. There must be a time that something can exist in a physical reality. There must be space, because if I don't have nowhere to put the things, then it's not going to happen. There also has to be matter. Doesn't matter, but there has to be molecules. There has to be something physical or some kind of attribute that is tangible to the senses. And in light of time, space, and matter, there must be energy or a force to make all this possible. Life requires all 4 of those things. When I look at Genesis 1:1, it gives me all 4 of those. In the beginning, time, God, energy, made the heavens, space, and the earth, matter. So if I'm looking at what is the Bible's ultimate conclusion for where did all life come from, well, even the answers or the things that science would say, you must have these things, the Bible begins by saying, well, here's your answer to all that. Now the answer may come up, well, where did that space come from? Well, if God made all those things, then I think that is the first designer. Now it goes to the ontological argument. Does He fit the mold? Does He have the power to be able to create such things? When I read through the rest of the Bible, yeah, He does. But it's really hard for me not to be able to say as I read through Genesis 1:1, wow, He must be a very incredible being because He did all these things in chapter 1. Now, I think it's interesting as well. I'll mention this and then we'll close in Exodus 20. If you did good on your pretest on saying what was in the 6 days of creation, if you wrote down, but there's 7, yes, there are 7 days in a week, but God didn't make anything except for sweet rest on day 7. I need to remember He made that for us to enjoy. But when I look through all 6 days, the first 3 days, I'm looking at the creation of habitats or environments, something that can be inhabited by something else. So when I see that God divided the light from the darkness, it's interesting, light is not matter, but it is energy. And when I look at the essence of God, I mean, His essence is, He is light. He is nothing but energy if we look at it from a scientific perspective, but then there's more unknowns that come with that. So when I look at the space aspect, light from darkness, sky from the water where He's on the earth, and it says that He separates the water from the waters, and it talks about the sky, at least in the upper firmament, That is the region that would be considered space and even beyond that. When I get to day 3, we focus closer on matter on the earth, except it would say that God caused the dry land to separate from the water, and he called the dry land earth. I need to be careful as I read through my Bible. Sometimes earth can only be in reference to the dry land. Sometimes earth can be a reference to how we interpret it in the English language, and even from a couple hundred years ago, the whole planet. Otherwise, it just uses the word world to incorporate everything about this planet. So I need to be careful how I read through that. But the back half of this, I find, I skipped it. Back half of this are the inhabitants and the populace. So when I look at day 4, day 4, I look at the sun, moon, stars galore. Day 5, birds and fish. That's not right. Fish and birds that fly. There are some fish that fly, hence we have fly fishing. Ooh. That's a joke. And then we have day 6 where mankind and the rest of beasts are made. Now, I find this interesting when people start to do some word studies through here, and they decide to pull in from the Psalms that a day with the Lord is like 1,000 years and so forth. I want you to look at God's own description of this incident, but I want you to look at what it's attached to, and then I want you to tell me how would the people of that time have interpreted what God just said. Look in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, and we're going to look at verses, I think it's 8 to 11. Exodus 20, 8 through 11. Now this is where they're beginning to receive the law of God. Calvin, can you ring the bell? And it would say, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. Pause. How did they understand that command? What do we see them doing every 7 24-hour days? 6 days they were going to do work. The 7th day, they were going to rest, practice the Sabbath, honor the Sabbath. Notice it would continue by saying, in it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within the gate. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Guess what God is saying according to the understanding of the people in this time? We work 6 24-hour days, and we must rest and honor God for 1 24-hour period. Guess what that tells me about the days of creation? They were 24-hour periods. That's a thus saith the Lord. So next week we're going to begin on the letter R, and we're going to begin looking at reason in creation. So keep this paper. We'll come back to this next week, Lord willing. So thank you for your time and attention. We'll be back in just a few moments.